So this isn't looking too bad now. We can now add new expenses here with amount, date, category, and a title. Those expenses are then added to the list. Of course, the styling, as mentioned, isn't finalized yet. We'll take care about that soon. But before we do that, I want to make sure that we can also get rid of expenses by swiping them away. So by swiping from right to left. And at the moment, this is not possible, but it's such a common pattern that Flutter also helps a lot with implementing this pattern. So how can we make sure that these items can be swiped away? Well, for that, we can go to our expenses list, where we have this list view builder with our expense items. And Flutter gives us a special widget, which we can wrap around list items that should be swipeable, or that should be dismissible, removable to be precise. And the widget conveniently is named Dismissible, like this. Now, Dismissible wants a child, and that should be the list item that can be swiped away. So in my case, my expense item. But it then also needs a key. And I mentioned this key before. It was always this thing which we accepted here in our constructors and forwarded to the parent widget. And that was all we had to do with keys thus far. Now the good news is that in most cases, in most widgets, that is all you have to do with keys. There is a good reason why we haven't seen keys being used anywhere besides registering them here in our constructors. But there sometimes are scenarios where those keys are actually needed, because this key mechanism exists to make widgets uniquely identifiable. And I'll dive a bit deeper into all of that in a later section. But in the end here, where we should be able to swipe widgets away and then remove the data that's associated with a widget, a key is needed to allow Flutter to uniquely identify a widget and the data that's associated with it. And such a key can be created by using the built-in value key constructor function. This creates a key object which can be used as a value for this key parameter. And as mentioned, for most widgets, you don't need to set any keys, you don't need to worry about keys at all, but here, for the dismissible widget, a key is needed to make sure that the correct data will be deleted. So here we must create such a key, and the value key wants an input. In the end, it wants some input that can be used as a unique identification criteria or value for the widget to which the key is attached. And in this case here, we could simply take our expense, identified by index, as a value for value key. And that's all we have to do regarding that key. With that, if we add a comma for formatting and save this, and maybe force a reload, you will see that you can now swipe those list items. And this then removes them. Now, the connected data is actually not removed. Therefore, if I add a new item here real quick, a new expense, you will see that I get an error. Basically because we have a mismatch between what's showing on the screen and which data is still stored internally. But this is generally how you get this swiping effect. Now, of course, we must make sure that we also do something when we swiped a widget away. And for that, you can add the onDismissed parameter, which allows you to trigger a function whenever one widget has been swiped away, so when it has been dismissed. And here I, of course, want to trigger a function which then removes the associated data from my list of expenses. So I want to update the registered expenses list whenever I swiped one of my expense items away. Therefore, we should go to the expenses Dart file, to the expenses state, therefore, where we also added add expense before, and add another method here. And this other method could be called remove expense, because that is what I want to do here. And in the end here, I want to get the expense that should be removed. And we can then call set state here. and reach out to the registered expenses, and there call remove and pass the expense that should be removed as a value. And that should make sure that the expense is not just removed visually from the screen, but also internally from that list of expenses that we managed. Now in expenses list, we must accept this function as an input so that we can call this remove expense function from inside this widget. Therefore, as we did it multiple times before in this course already, we can add a new property, which actually wants a function that returns nothing, but that takes an expense as an input. And that could be called onRemove expense here. And of course, this must be set when the expenses list widget is created. So we require it and then bind the named onRemove expense parameter to this property. And therefore, of course, down here, we can execute this function. However, we can't point at it like this because onDismissed actually wants a function as a value that takes a so-called dismiss direction as an input, which simply is some information that tells us whether we swiped from left to right or right to left, so that you could, in theory, do different things depending on how the user swiped. Now here I'll simply set this to an anonymous function, therefore, where I get this direction, and I'm not really interested in the direction, but I still have to accept it here. And then I can call onRemove expense, and then pass my expense as a value to onRemove expense, and basically ignore this direction. Well, and with that, we just have to make sure that remove expense is also passed as a value to expenses list. So therefore here, we now have to set this newly added onRemove expense named parameter and set it to a pointer that points at remove expense. Like this. And with that, if you save that and force a reload, if I now swipe this away, it's still gone, but now you will see that as I add a new expense here, I don't get that error because now the UI is in line with the internally managed data. And that's how easy it is to make items in a list dismissible.